it, but it is the cult of success.
So, how easy is it for you to detect?
The reason this can be a monster is because they're not the right person to do the job. And I think that's one of the problems with systemic problems is people think you can't solve them. I'm suddenly horrified by the trap I'd put myself into. And you're not allowed to ask me this question now.
Welcome to the show that shines a light on the biggest barriers and obstacles that get in the way of getting things done. The things that I like to call monsters and myths because they thrive and survive in the shadows of organizations, specifically because people don't ever talk about them. Today's guest I met as part of a panel that I was moderating earlier on this year, and during the interview and chats that we had at the event, so many things that she said resonated deeply with me, and I thought I'm going to have to bring her on the show to share her horror stories with us, really. So Thea, welcome to the show. Please can you tell our listeners and our audience a little bit about yourself and why it is that you have maybe encountered and hopefully overcome a few of these monsters and myths in your time?
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. Really excited to be here. So I'm the Head of Group Optimisation at Lloyds Banking Group. How I got there, though, is probably the interesting story about how I've encountered many monsters along the way, because before I was at Lloyds, I was a career consultant. So starting in a boutique consultancy and then moving on to IBM for 10 years. So obviously saw countless clients along the way, mostly banks, but also some public sector. And within lots and lots of different types of transformation, from kind of setting up a digital bank to doing a payments engine to working on something post-merger to try and get two organizations to become one, obviously, in their finance processes, moving on to kind of specializing in operating models and then looking at kind of fintech strategy. I think across the board, and then obviously having moved across to Lloyds, I've seen most monsters in most places, as well as some things which have gone really right and some things that have gone very wrong. But I think it's given me a very broad spectrum from which to draw for this show.
Absolutely fabulous. And perhaps I shouldn't start off by mentioning that I was reading a blog just today where somebody identified consultants as being a monster, and it actually tagged me in the thing saying another monster for your list. So maybe we won't go there right now. That you
are a formed monster then, in that basis.
In the past, you may have been considered a monster by some of the people that may be watching or listening in your past life, in your consultant life, I hasten to say. So as is normal with this show, I have absolutely no idea what your monsters and myths are. So I get to hear about it at the same time as everybody else. So let's dive straight in. What's your number one, your first monster or myth that you want to talk about?
So I'd like to say, in terms of this, like, the concept is fantastic, and it has been like kind of rattling around my brain for the number of weeks since we set this up. And I think that the interesting thing that I've got to with a couple of my monsters and myths is that they are related to each other. And so the fact that there is a monster or a myth allows the other one to turn up. So I think a couple of mine have two sides to them. They're like a Janus of the monster and myth world. So my first one is actually the wrong monster. And what I mean by that is that organizations are often focused on something, or they're trying to change something which isn't actually the monster that is holding them back. So there's quite often, obviously, operating models and the way that organizations work is a specialism, but a lot of times you get something which is a change in organizational design. So it's how we're set up, which is the problem. And so you get changes to organization, teams moving around, etc. Or similarly, you might have a kind of this leader is a problem, but when the leader leaves, not much changes. So I think this is the principle of the kind of the wrong monster is actually if you've got systemic problems, then fixing one individual part is not actually going to fix your problem. So you need to look at the system as a whole, and then you need to go from there. So taking something like I really like, and I think that's one of the problems with systemic problems is people think you can't solve them. But actually, I think there are quite a few approaches where people have taken to solving them, like governance and bureaucracy. And everyone goes, that's really hard to solve. But, you know, Amazon have their type 1 and type 2 errors. Al Gore have their below the line, above the line that causes you to make governance choices at the right point. And I think that's where people find those more systemic problems really hard to solve. But actually, if you faced into them, as opposed to dealt with the kind of the individual way that that's turning up, then you'd have more success at being able to solve the overarching problem.
So how easy is it for you to detect when it's the wrong problem that people are focusing on? Because I think this is one of the difficult things with monsters and myths. And it's great that you love the concept. What I love about it is it really makes people think, what truly is the blocker? You know, what is the thing that's getting in the way? So focusing on the wrong thing, great monster, but how do you go about identifying, hey, look, no, we are focusing on the wrong thing? How do you identify that monster?
I think there are a few techniques. I mean, I love like the 5 whys technique as a way of kind of getting down to the root cause of a problem. But actually, I've come across something that's actually kind of from race action at the moment, which I really loved as an approach for dealing with racism, which was called the groundwater approach. And it talks about where you've got different lakes, basically, and you have, let's say a fish has died, that if one fish has died, then you can treat the problems that are associated with that fish. If in a lake, a lot of fish have like kind of died, then treat the problems in that lake. But actually, you've got lots of lakes with lots of dead fish, then you need to take a more groundwater approach to the problem. And so I think that's a really interesting way of looking at problems is how often are they turning up? In what scenarios? If they're everywhere in a slightly different guise or a similar problem, then you've probably got a systemic problem. If they're in an individual area, then you can probably take a local approach to dealing with it. So I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it, to know whether your problem is local or more systemic.
That is, and I hadn't thought about it in that way, but what it does resonate in terms of a technique is I often use clustering. So I will run workshops with multiple groups of people, and when the same themes arise across all of the groups of people and we cluster those together, then management can't say, oh, it's that area and it's that area, if the same themes are repeatedly coming up. So it's really it's similar. So have you got any suggestions on, so you can identify it, you can find out, how do you solve it? Have you got thoughts on that? Have you seen that done well?
How you solve systemic problems?
Yeah, what's the magic required? Because the whole, this is monsters, myths, and magic. Hopefully, you've got an idea on the magic required to dispel the monster.
So I think it obviously depends on what the nature of the actual problem is. But for example, let's take you've got a problem with leadership and you think it's an individual leader, but then you realize that it's actually more of a systemic cause. Then you've got to look at like how were those people selected? Is there something in the way that you are selecting them which is causing them, or is there something in the way that they're incentivized which is causing great leaders to act in not great ways? And I think that's where you're looking at systemic aspects to the problem, as opposed to going, we've got the wrong leaders, or we need to solve it through a people problem. So I think that's you look at the system around them to try and bring out the best in a person, as opposed to necessarily looking at people individually, or looking at the systems that created them in order to make sure you get to the best leaders to solve the problem that you've got.
Systems thinking, I love it. As a futurist, you're talking my language there. Everything affects everything else. Just talking about leadership, there was a keynote speaker at an event that I went to recently, and he was from a large bank. And he took over as the CEO, and within a very short space of time, he fired an entire middle layer of management in the organization, hundreds of people. It sent shockwaves through the entire organization. But he had identified that this particular layer was the blocker. They were the biggest inhibitor to any change because nothing could get past them. So he just fired them, the whole lot of them. Radical, absolutely never heard of anything like that. And the audience actually gasped when and he went, I stand by my choice. I just blanket decision, got rid of them all. It is one way of solving a systemic problem, because then, of course, it sent a message through everybody either side of that layer that, you have to start making things move. And he said, things started happening immediately. Innovation started happening, change and transformation. The blockers just fell away after that. So there are radical approaches that can also be taken. Great start. So tell me, what is the next one? What's your number 2 on the list? Monsters or myths?
So I think I might link it to the first one, because I think there's an interesting link together, which is the person with the right job title. So the reason this can be a monster is because they're not the right person to do the job. And I think this is a really interesting one, because it's often that, let's say something needs to happen, you give it to the person who's the most obvious person to do that particular task, because they have the job of the head of compliance, and this is a compliance problem or similar. And I think where that can go awry is where that person can't reasonably have the skill set that is required to do the actual task that they are being handed. So they're brilliant at doing one job, but not the job that you're asking them to do. And I think this is where there's a really interesting, I'm sure you've come across it, but Simon Wardley had this idea of like pioneers, settlers, and town planners about how you're doing innovation. And the pioneers go out and they come up with the crazy ideas, and they're out there in the wild, and they're coming up with, they're the innovators, and then the settlers will kind of make it so, and they'll take it from MVP to being a product, and then the town planners are the ones who can scale it, and then they can run the towns, right? But you're not going to, if you are trying to take a business area and you're trying to, move it from a period where it has been steady to one of growth, you probably aren't going to do that best with a town planner. You're going to do that better with a pioneer. And that's where I think people are chosen because of particular skill sets, or that they are really experienced in a particular area, rather than necessarily they fit the task that is ahead of them. And that, I think, is what is quite interesting about trying to better fit. And I think this is, if you think about the future of work, something that we can get better at, which is fitting rather than being very kind of pigeonholed into a particular role. And I think we've got worse about it recently in terms of like, you are a product owner and you are an engineering lead, and you do full stack, and you're allowed to do this and you're allowed to do that. And I think it's become a bit more pigeonholed, whereas actually there's a lot of ways that you can move around, that it's much more about your approach to it, and that, you shouldn't give a pioneer a town planner job, and equally, you shouldn't give someone who can do a very brilliant run system, you shouldn't give them something to start something new, because they're just not going to be particularly good at it. But it quite often happens that the person who has the job title gets the task, the thing to do. Whereas, and I think because you're going to ask me about some magic.
Well, before we get onto the magic, I just have to say that one of the things that frustrates me in an innovation role, and has frustrated me many times over when I used to work in corporate days, was that the job of innovation was highly prized title. People saw it as, head of innovation, or so you get to play with all the cool stuff. And often the title was awarded to people because of maybe their seniority or a bit of internal politics, that somebody maneuvered themselves. But they were the worst possible people to have. They were uninspiring. They had no, foresight or anything like. They didn't have the tool sets, but they were now gifted this title of head of innovation, and companies just wither because of that. That's just poor appointment in the first place. But before we get on to the magic as well, why do you think it is that people that receive a task because of their job title, but that they are ill-equipped to handle? Why is it, do you think, that there is so much reluctance for them to say, that's not me? Is there just the stigma attached in a corporate environment that if you say no, that people will think you're incompetent or you can't do the job, as opposed to you reframing it and saying, no, that's not what I'm good at, because I know the stuff that I'm not good at. And in the past, maybe it's just because I'm old and cranky, but when I was given a task that I was ill-equipped to do, either because of my personality, my nature, my attention span, whatever it was, I would simply turn around and say, that's not going to go well if you give me that task. And I can tell you that up front, and I'm telling you now, I can probably suggest somebody much better for it. And it's not because I don't want to do work. It's because I know what I'm not good at. And people respected that, but it's not a behavior that I've seen very often. What do you think is the reason that those people with the right job title but the wrong skills, why don't they push back?
So I think there are probably a number of facets around it where you don't want to say no to your boss, and your boss has decided that you should be doing that. This is part of your role and you should do it. There's a kind of people pleasing element where you want to be able to say yes. I suspect you're worried, as you said, that it'll be seen as you are being generally incompetent if you feel that you can't do this particular job, and that they will find someone else who is, the complete package, who can do all these things, and you're just being awkward about it. And I think the nature of hierarchy makes it harder for you to just pull someone in who might be really good at that job from elsewhere, or to swap people out without it being seen as some kind of failure or that you have decided for us. So I think that's the nature of why it is harder. You can't just pull someone in who is equally senior than you. Terribly expensive. And even if that's the right choice to make at the time. So I think there's about...
Because it is, you're talking about hierarchy and seniority, and this is where I think organizational structures are just so broken. These self-forming organizations and sort of cooperative organizations, which you must be familiar with coming from your consulting background, where the best people with the best skills for the job were the ones that did it. And to hell with job titles. You were all an equally high or equally low job title, but basically teams are assembled dynamically to be able to get stuff done. But corporate world, particularly in financial services and banking, it's all politics and hierarchy. So I'm going to ask you now what the magic is, because otherwise I'll carry on banging on about.
I think I'm going to challenge the other way though, and I'm playing devil's advocate because I love some of the approaches to kind of the teal organisations that you're referring to, but they haven't tended to work at kind of significant scale or take on something, and they tend to, like, quite a lot of them have collapsed into bureaucracy, exactly the thing that you're not trying to create as you get to greater numbers. And actually, hierarchy is an incredibly strong way of maintaining a very vast or a very large organization. So I think it has, and you see it in the animal world, that things tend to kind of return to it ultimately. So I think there's almost a strangely natural state around hierarchy, but that doesn't mean that it has to be totally inflexible. And I think there's bits you can learn from each side in order to say, like, how do we flexibly form teams, even if we want them to be hierarchical? How do we make it easier to create a virtual team amongst people to go off and do a piece of work for a bit, and make it easy to form the team that solves the problem, and then they return, but don't create a massive program around it and need all the bureaucracy that comes with that. And that they can kind of join a squad and then they can disperse and they don't lose their original job. I think there are approaches if you're meet, but you need to do it meaningfully, and that's where I think it comes back to that systemic piece, where if it's a systemic problem, like breaking up a hierarchy or making it more fluid, it becomes a harder problem to solve individually in any area.
And it is, as you say, it is systemic, because a lot of the hierarchies are also linked to reward and remuneration packages and bonuses and targets and things like that. So, yes, I've got the best person for the job on my team, but I'm sure as hell not going to give that person to you to be able to achieve your objective, because I need that person in my team to achieve my objective. Otherwise, I'm not going to get my bonus. And yeah, that's
talent hoarding. Yeah, exactly.
Magic.
We
didn't discuss magic. So the magic lies in the ability to have flexibility, appropriate flexibility when required, which is a really, really tough one. Have you ever achieved that within a corporate structure?
I mean, you know what? There's actually one thing that I was incredibly proud of in a situation where actually it was at Lloyds, where we needed to deliver something very close to Christmas. So you can imagine how much fun that was. And it needed basically everyone to come together. And in that scenario, and a lot of people to down tools on something to pick something else up to make sure that we got that thing over the line. And actually, in that kind of scenario where you've got a particular target and everyone can see that that is the most important thing to do, and you just saw an amazing, and I think it's very collaborative. So you saw an amazing amount of people just doing their own self-sacrifice to say, I will go up through my line to make sure that this gets the right resources and they get moved across. You don't need to do it. Let me take it. I will go and do it. And that amazing kind of pulling together of people around a problem. So I mean, focus is an amazing piece. If everyone wants to do something, then you can really pull an organization together to do it. And suddenly flexibility is okay. You saw it with, the response to COVID in terms of what got delivered so quickly, because everything was galvanized around it and you knew you had to respond, and it was so incredibly important because you had to respond for our colleagues, for our clients, for our customers in a way that the normal ways of working were not going to work for. So again, everyone piled in, got focused, got it done, and it's incredible to see it when you do get that flexibility happen in an organization. So that's why I think we should just have it as a BAU.
You're right there. We know it can be done, and then post-COVID, things have started going back to the old ways, kind of a thing. And I had a lot of hope that post-COVID people would have changed their ways significantly enough, because it takes a while for behaviors to change, and COVID stuck around for quite a while. But I see old behaviors creeping back in again. But I live in hope. I live in hope that the magic will work and that we can have more flexible organizations and approaches to it.
Me too.
So let's get on to your last one. What's number 3 on your list?
Okay, so this one, again, I think has 2 sides to it, but it is the cult of success.
Yes!
So what this is about is, and I do, a reasonable amount of recruitment. I look at a number of CVs. We talk, like I mentor a lot of people. It's all about how do you present yourself. And we're all doing our lovely kind of star approaches. We're taking our situation, our task, we've got our actions, we've delivered our results, and we, if you read everyone's CVs, the world would be an amazing place because of the amount of success we have all achieved in all our different places. And if you look at that collective success, oh my gosh, the world must be amazing. However, in reality, there are two sides to that which I think are monstrous. So one side of it, which is quite often you are, it may look very actually three sides. It may look very impressive, but how you contribute to that was probably a lot more random than it looks in a particular CV. So it might have been someone else's idea that caused that to be amazingly successful, or you're lucky or you're unlucky as to whether you're successful or not. And that's what drives it. I think another part of that is actually, where do we do our most learning? It's in our failures. Like, in reality, we become better people, like much better people, more from our failures than our successes, in my view. We learn a huge amount about ourselves, what we can do, what we can't do, what we should do, like the retrospection that goes into how you think about it, even if you have like a micro failure, right? It is a lot, and you learn a lot from it. You learn less from your successes. And so I think actually, in a weird way, a true CV that was peppered with successes and failures would tell you more about what someone really could do. And then the third part of it is that I think it creates this, and I was looking up the statistics that were referring to like the number of CEOs who were psychopaths, which there was a Babiak and Hare study on it, that it was around 4% versus 1% in the general population. And I think that the cult of success that inspires people to, like, for those people who are particularly jazz hands, who are performative rather than interested in performance, to actually rise higher, because they're the ones who will say that they've always been successful, that everything has been amazing, and they'll do so without any compunction, without anything else, because, you know, that's their personality style. And I think it doesn't necessarily bring to the top the best leaders. And so that's why I went for the cult of success.
That is, I was trying to, while you were talking, I was trying to find, I've got a quote somewhere that says exactly that. We learn little from our success and we learn from our failure. It's something along those lines. Couldn't find the quote. Might have to put it in the show notes. But it is so true. And I think it's got a lot worse in recent years because of social media, because, you know, the Instagram lifestyle, you know, everybody just puts their best self forward kind of a thing, and it becomes over amplified, and it's that sort of reinforcement loop. Everybody wants a pat on the back, and everybody wants, you know, to be told how great they're doing, and they want to show everybody how great they're doing. And yeah, I look at people's LinkedIn profiles and I go, really, you delivered that by yourself, huh? And I look at some of the things, and successful, experienced entrepreneur who's only been out of university 2 years and has only had one job, and they list all of these: launched this, made this, disrupted that, and I'm thinking, in 2 years in a financial services institution. You'd be lucky if you got a decision in that amount of time, let alone, we know what decision making is like. That's also one of our monsters and myths that we talk about. So that one's easy to spot. So spotting the cult of success and the problems around it, easy. Harder question: what's the magic? How do we dispel this? How do we turn it down a notch? How do we make it real? Is it linked to, I don't want to go the American style of celebrating our failures. No, I don't think we need to crack a champagne bottle every time, but the retrospectives and things like that, I think, are a really good start, because I think that there's a huge fear of failure, particularly in corporate. People think, well, if I fail, I'm not going to get a promotion or something like that. And I think we need to normalize failure as part of the learning process, as you said. What's your thoughts on how do we get rid of this? How do we make people not feel that they have to push this amazingly successful person first? Would you hire the people that didn't have all of that in their CVs, by the way?
It's really interesting from a CV point of view, right? Because I was suddenly horrified by the trap I'd put myself into. And you're not allowed to ask me this question now, where you would suddenly ask me, so, like, tell me about your greatest failure in the last year or in the last 10 years. And that'd be horrifying. So I think there's an aspect of it which is about that there is a natural thing while you're trying to put yourself forward for something that you want to present yourself as your best self, Thea on the most amazing day. But I think there's another part of this, which is maybe less about standing up in front of a crowd and saying where I had failed, but more about documenting lessons learned from group collective pieces in a more honest and transparent way to tell the next generation or the next person who does that kind of thing what you screwed up, what you did well, what you do again, how you would have done things differently, why you think, was it really a failure in what you were doing, or was it a failure in how it was set up? Was it the salesperson who missold it in the first place, which meant it could never be successful? How did you just have the wrong constraints around you that meant that? So was it a true test of whether that could have succeeded? What were the reasons why it was late? Was it misestimated at the front? Maybe you should be working on stopping people from misestimating things rather than kind of bashing the people who then didn't get it delivered. If it was always kind of misestimated at the front, you had no chance, a real chance of getting it through. And I think if you could have those honest conversations, document it, and then those were more available. So you could say, the next type of thing, if you're setting up that has these characteristics, here are all the lessons learned that people have done. They're anonymized. You don't know exactly who did what, but you can learn from that and then take that forward into the next time, because history repeats itself all the time. And yet we don't, and this is true for the world as much as the country, as much as an organization, we don't learn enough from history. And I think if we thought about it collectively and how we work together, and actually how that creates our successes and how that creates our failures, we'd get kind of further forward than this more individualistic cult of success approach.
And I love the idea of documenting that and passing it on for future generations of whether it's product owners, product managers, change managers, innovators, disruptors, whoever it is. It's almost like a handbook of here's the legacy of those who went before you, kind of a thing. And I'd shown you these little cards that I'm taking the monsters and myths and turning them into these little cards. One of my clients has actually made their own pack and is using them as part of the onboarding pack for new project managers. Specifically for that reason, they are saying, here be monsters. These are the archetype people and common behaviors you will find in this organization. They've identified the systemic issues that they can't fix, or aren't willing to try and bite that one at the moment, but they're warning their change managers and their innovation people, this is what you're likely to encounter in this organization. And here's our cheat sheet, a couple of notes for you on how to go about solving it. I mean, the one that I'm holding up there is the silver bullet myth, which I'm sure that you've come across the silver bullet myth when a senior executive comes back from some event and they've been wined and dined and taken to golf or something like that, and they come back and they say, this is the product that we need to buy. It will solve all of the problems, silver bullet. Or everything that you've been complaining about, you've just got to buy this and, we can get this really good deal and just get it and implement it and all of those problems off your sheet. I'm making your life so much easier. And then it's up to you to show them in a tactful way how actually they've had smoke blown up rear end or something like that. But it's that kind of a thing. So I do love your approach there of documenting it, putting it together, and almost having it as a pack to go on.
And the other thing the one add that I would do to that is allow different perspectives on what went wrong. Because I think different people have a very different view on what happened in any situation. Actually, all of them are quite interesting. I think another thing with lessons learned, so you can summarize them up and you can put them into themes, but I think that loses some of the richness, or necessarily the leader may not have the most accurate view of what went wrong versus, I know, a BA that was sitting in a feature team who just had a very broad perspective and so actually saw more. So actually some more of those voices that are in those lessons learned, rather than trying to summarize it too much, so that people can dig into it a bit more and really hear the stories that came from it. Because that's what, we tell stories in order to, have a better way through the world. And I think we should tell stories of our failures as well as our successes, or actually the mixture of both that tends to be everyday life, right? Because even with your greatest success, there are parts of it where things didn't go brilliantly. So I think it's the full story of how you got somewhere tends to be littered with a few failures along the way.
Now there's a job title that I've never seen inside an organization: the person to document and chronicle the stories that come out of there. I think there's a new vocation there for somebody. I'd love to give that one a bash at some day. Thea, thank you very much for your time and for sharing the stories of your monsters and myths. We've come up against time, so I've got nothing more to say other than I wish you well monster hunting, and thank you once again for sharing with everybody.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to be here.